term mean to you, and how do you apply it in your role?
That's a good question, Nikki. Managing up, to me, I like to explain it from a perspective of influencing without authority, right? So being able to influence actions, change thought processes in a way that is beneficial not just for your executive, but also for the larger and broader vision. I think for me, managing up takes there are quite a few moving parts. I think initially, there is an importance around building the relationship with your exec, which is one component trust, one component, working style, things of that nature. And then really understanding what that executive's blind spots are. I think it takes some time to understand how to manage up with that particular executive because it is very different across executives. So there is a bit of a learning curve there, a bit of a discovery period, I think, initially for me, before kind of launching into really actively managing up and identifying those opportunities to do so.
Yeah, Pam, I can see you nodding there. Is there anything you'd add to that? And again, how do you perceive it in your role?
Well, as always, and unsurprisingly, I agree with Andrew. And my perspective on managing up is kind of funny because I have this resistance to the term because to me it feels a little bit like pushing back, which is also a term that I don't like to use, but it's something that we actually have to do. So being resistant to the way something sounds doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. I would add one more piece just from my own perspective, which is when I have a manager, I'm very aware that I have a manager and I'm being managed. And I think in the context of managing up, that transparency is also important because it takes away that feeling of I'm trying to get away with something or trying to push my will over the will of someone else, and aligns more with what Andrew was saying, which is that we're actually influencing without explicit authority. And I think that makes it a lot easier to be free to do what we need to do to support our executives.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there. And I totally understand what you mean. It kind of has a sort of, it sounds a bit manipulative, doesn't it?
Yes,
exactly. It does.
Yeah,
it definitely really does.
Yeah, so you don't, I think, and it's probably why a lot of assistants shy away from doing it because we're people pleasers and we're supporting. So it kind of sounds like the opposite of what we would tend to be like in our personalities. Mm-hmm. So I completely see your point on that. And I can see why a lot of assistants would shy away from doing it. But if once we break it down, I think a lot of assistants after listening to the two of you speaking will sort of see how important it is to be able to do that. So I really want to dive into it. And I want to come to a point that you mentioned there, Andrew, and it's around evaluating your executives' needs. So I know that you both do that obviously on a day-to-day basis. So how do you go about doing that? And how have you developed that skill over the years? Why don't we come back to you, Pam?
First and foremost, evaluating an executive's needs has to do with activating the empathy. So, and by that I mean putting ourselves in their position and saying, okay, what would I need if I were going to do this thing? So for instance, if they're going on a trip and you're thinking, okay, well, they're going to London tomorrow and I've made the arrangements. If I were going, where would I look to see what time I leave? And I'd think, oh, it's in the calendar. So I'd make sure it's in the calendar. I would say, oh, I need a car. Is the car coming? Those sorts of things that make you step into the shoes of your executive, builds that empathetic mindset, which helps you to evaluate what their needs are. And then I'd say, as obvious as it sounds, it doesn't always occur to me. I also just ask outright, is there something you're prioritizing that I might not know about? Is there something that's a stressor for you in this particular situation that I can help really for you? And just having those quick check-ins makes it much, much easier to understand what the executive's needs are and to help us figure out how we can manage up to fill those needs.
And Andrew, what do you do to go about evaluating your executive's needs?
So I think initially there are a lot of conversations that are had. I think, there are some components of evaluating your exec's needs that don't come out in the moment until you are faced with a situation. And honestly, that may go contrary to what they told you, but you're kind of course correcting that picture in the moment, right? So that's one part of it. I think the other part is really getting a sense of, asking your executive the right questions. How do you like to work? What are your travel preferences? What things do you need to feel comfortable? So it's, I think, resisting the urge to stick with just the surface questions and really get into the meat of what that executive is really saying and what they're really looking for, and what those needs are. And that takes time. I think for me, with my executive, I've tried to establish a relationship with of trust and flawless execution in most cases. So I think those build on each other. And I think, tweaking them, being open to feedback is also very important when it comes to understanding your executive's needs and not being afraid to get it wrong. There are going to be some times where actions need to be taken and you really have to just make that snap decision. I always say sometimes it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. And I think that's the ideology that you really have to think about and lean into when you're assessing your person's needs, because they will change.
It's funny, like this isn't something that you just get good at and then you coast through your career. It's you have to be so adaptable to it because the business evolves and your executives evolve and maybe your interests evolve. And so, Andrew, as you were talking, I was thinking, it's so true. It's like you become an expert at something and you're the person who can make those calls. And then one day you make the call that just makes you feel like you don't know what you're doing. That's actually very natural. And that ownership, as long as there's trust in that relationship, it makes it a learning point for everybody. And it's just so valuable. So I really needed to hear that. Thank you.
I was just going to say, I love, there's a quote that another speaker said once, which was proceed until apprehended. And I just think that works quite well for assistants. Because it just,
absolutely.
That's how you learn in the role, isn't it? You've got to start making those decisions. So it's best to have the confidence to keep going.
Yeah. I mean, one point that I will say, just to wrap up that point, is you do have to insert yourself. A lot of times for my executive and in my role, the information isn't as forthcoming as you may want it to be. So there are some instances where you may ask an executive a question that they really haven't thought about it. Sometimes they just go through the motions and they really haven't taken the time to think about what they really need. So there's kind of that piece of it as well.
Yeah, I think there's and you guys can answer this. I think it's exactly as you said there, Andrew. They don't always know what they need or they want. And I think sometimes that can be frustrating for an assistant. So I wonder how you've gone about getting to know what they need and want without them knowing. Is there a secret art to this, or is it a case of just being very observant? Pam, maybe you can
I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a little bit of both. I do think that there is a little bit of fact finding that you have to do. Being very observant is hugely important, I think, with that skill set. There is, looking at the little bits of information, if as an EA you have the good fortune to have access to your executive's inbox, that's a great way to, mine information, to kind of see what their quirks are, to understand how they respond in certain situations. So, I think it took me the better part of a year to really get to a place where I felt comfortable with knowing what she needs and what she wants in every context, and so it does take time.
Yeah, I might also add that I mentioned earlier about asking explicitly what those needs are. And what that does is sometimes, if the setting is just right, it gives you a very well thought out response. But very often the needs come up when things are stressful or moving quickly. And our executive's response might not be the same in that moment. So one of the things that has helped me in the past too is to, in addition to that observation, which Nikki mentioned earlier, which is, it's one of our biggest skills as admins. We can eavesdrop. It's very skillful eavesdropping. It's like you put it in here and you tuck it away and it's not our information until we need it. And then we just act on the information instead of sharing the information. So that's always super useful. But the other piece is asking questions or making observations that are maybe tangential to the question at hand. So for example, if I notice that my executive is stressed out right before he flies, it's not true in this case, but if I made that observation instead of asking, are you stressed out before you fly? I might ask, how much time do you need to pack? Because that might be the thing that's stressing him out. I don't know, but I'll ask that. We'll have that quick discussion. Oh, 15 minutes is no time. I'm like, okay, that's not it. Is there anything you have to do at home before you take off? Just things that aren't very specific to the question, but give me the context I need to make an assumption. That's also helpful.
I'd like to talk, and it moves on nicely to this point around something you said there at the beginning, Andrew, which was understanding some of the maybe not so great stuff about our executives, some of maybe the limitations that they have. And again, I know when it comes to managing up, assistants should kind of understand their executives' limitations and then be able to fill in the gaps. So, Andrew, just coming back to you, as you mentioned this earlier, how have you gone about doing that in your career? And are there any examples that you can give to our audience today of how you've done that?
So for me, I think in terms of just really kind of understanding how my executive functions and understanding kind of their quirks and preferences and some of those needs that are not quite visible. I think for me, it's been a lot of debriefing after the fact with Jen, right? So, you know, not just the usual, well, how did the trip go? More so as well, how are you feeling? You know, Jen and I have talked a lot about her cognitive load. So in other words, at what point of the day is she most mentally alert, right? So if I know, for example, that her best part of the day is earlier in the morning, right, then I know, okay, I can book that flight early in the morning. She's fine, so forth and so on, right? So it's digging deep into, you know, hey, when do you eat? You know, do you need to eat? You know, some execs are, you know, more snackers. Some need dedicated time to actually sit down and eat, right? So it's understanding those quirks and understanding those times when your executive, for example, might be tired or stressed. Reading them is really important, I think, so that there will come a time when you as an EA do not have to ask your exec, how are you feeling, how are you doing? In your interactions with them, you can see how they're doing. You understand, you know, just from facial expressions and how they're acting. So again, it does take time to get there, but I feel like really taking the time to think through every facet of, you know, that executive's experience, and not just how they act on a tangible and logistical level, but how they're feeling, what their emotional and mental state is. And there are a lot of ways that you can go about doing that depending upon your exec.
Yeah, and I guess how much they want to be vulnerable with you and let you in.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Pam?
As always, I agree with Andrew. And you know, another thing that comes to mind, this is a very familiar lament. I think every EA you ever talk to will say, I can't get my exec to stop saying yes to everything. And I think it's every successful executive has that tendency, I think, because they're excited about the work they're doing. So they do want to be involved. And yes, they do say no here and there, but sometimes you'll look at the calendar and think, how on earth are we going to get all of this done? And I think one of the tools that I try to use for that is having the conversation with Robert that says, when you say yes to something, can you loop me in right away so I can help manage the expectation? And sometimes what that means is, I like to say yes too. So we're a great match. And then a coworker and I talk about it as yes with extras. So yes, later. Yes, but maybe we'll bring somebody else in too. Yes, but not right now. You know, like those sorts of things that just sort of, I can go in and support his priorities, but help to stack them after the fact, which is something I find a little bit helpful.
Yeah, I used to work with I was the EA to the COO, and we had a CEO of the organisation that was just not a people person. He was very quiet. He would stay in his office a lot. You had to go into his office to go in to meet with him. He very rarely came out of his office, but technically he was fantastic. But he wasn't really the kind of leader in the organisation that maybe it needed in terms of people management. But his assistant was so gregarious, full of life, happy. So it was that it balanced itself out really well, but that wasn't her natural kind of state of things, but she just overdid it at work because it helped kind of build that gap that we needed in the organization to have somebody that was, you know, nice. For a better word. But that's whenever I think about managing up, I think about how she was that gap in the organization that he needed to be a better leader. And I think he must have known that somewhere along the lines, because they weren't an obvious match. She would try and bring him out of his shell a little bit, which was hard, but she tried her hardest. So it's those kind of gap filling sometimes as executives need that assistants can bring in.
Yeah, but I also think, you know, guys, that it also has to do with, I think, looking out for your executives' blind spots. You know, Jen is definitely one of those people that loves to say yes to everything. So I think one of the things that I've done, for example, is make sure that, you know, those interactions are A, serving the right purpose, right? And B, laddering up to the overall vision, right? So, you know, there was an instance, for example, where, you know, she wanted to do kind of a bunch of one-on-ones, stack up free time. And the question I asked was simple. It's like, you know, does this send the right message, right? So if you're asking your executive questions that are making them think based on what their values are, that's a good way to manage up as well. Yeah.
Do you guys do a lot of, here's everything that we've got going on, where are we going to fit in the rest of the things that you're saying yes to? Do you do a lot? Is there a lot of that?
I do a little bit of that but my modification is, instead of it being where will we fit it in, instead I'll say, okay, so instead of doing this, do you want to do that? And then when they see it like that, you know, because the where do you fit it in says, well, you know, somewhere, find a space. Like, no, we're at the point now where we're in a closed system. There are only 24 hours in the day. We've got 27 hours worth of things. So I think the 3 hours that we're not going to do are these. However, you're not going to pick those extra 3 hours of sleep. So you tell me what goes in there instead.
It definitely narrows the mind, doesn't it?
Right, exactly.
Well, it brings us really nicely on to the next thing that I wanted to talk to you both about, and that is around giving feedback and being honest with your executive, which I know a lot of assistants struggle with, but it's so important, particularly when you work at the level that the two of you work at. So Pam, how do you go about being honest with your executive and giving them feedback?
I feel really, really lucky, because when I interviewed for this role, one of the questions that I asked was, you know, what's something that really frustrates you? And he said that what's frustrating to him is when people wait to deliver bad news, because his reaction will be the same no matter what, but the amount of time to fix the situation is shortened if he's not brought in early. And I thought about that and I thought, this is great, because I very often wanted to just raise the white flag and thought, no, my exec's going to want me to fix this first. And so that helps, because then I had this voice. And so with respect to feedback, I can give an example. So in October of last year, my exec wanted to do an offsite. And as we all recall, we are still in a global pandemic. And I said, no, it needs to be virtual. And so he said, well, we can do it in person, but we have to figure out a place. I will spare you all the details, but given the COVID requirements and the locations of his team members, we landed on Germany as the place where we could have this offsite. And it needed to be done in, I think it was 5 weeks' time. And so I said, I don't think we can do this. And here is why. And here's a past example of an ambitious idea that you have had that was really, really hard to execute. And he would nod along. He says, I think we can do it. I pushed back. There's that word. And he won, and the offsite happened, and everything was great. And then I made an offhand remark to him that was like, oh, I shouldn't have pushed back so hard. And he said, absolutely not. Please do that always, because it helps me understand what the limitations are. I believed that you could pull this off, and you did. And everyone was safe, which was my number one priority. But let's keep having those conversations like that. Please don't ever stop being the voice of dissension with me. And so I think even just having a conversation with your exec that says, are you okay if we disagree? And how do you want to navigate that? because it's, for me, as long as I'm not doing it in public, we still have this facade of this really, it's not even a facade, it's actually true, this very tight partnership. And so as long as we know that behind the scenes, we can say, oh, I don't know about this. No, you can do this.
It goes to show when you have that level of partnership, what you can achieve. Because I think probably because you were pushing back and he was saying, no, we can do it, you probably gave it so much more thought, because Absolutely. You were like, well, if we are going to do it, then I need to, go full in on this one. Unless obviously it gets to a point where like, I told you so. Which I'm sure you've got loads of those examples as well.
Right. And the beauty of it is we're both invested in each other's success. So at the point when I realized, okay, this is not going away, I was fully committed to making sure it worked out really well.
Because you want them to succeed, exactly as you said. Yeah. Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, I think, for me, first, I feel like you have to pick your battles, right? I think to Pam's point, you're not going to win every battle. Not that it's about winning and losing, but you're not going to, your exec is not going to do or take your advice 100% of the time. So it's going in with that expectation. I think for me, the other thing is making sure that you are aware of your feelings around your executive's feelings. What I mean by that is, if you are giving an idea, your boss kind of dismisses it out of hand, or the feedback or the honesty isn't well received, there is going to be kind of this emotional trigger that you kind of have to deal with, right? It's just because we're all human. But I think it's being able to work through that and say, okay, do I need to change the narrative around what I'm saying, or is this just kind of a flat out no? And I think to Pam's point, when you really understand what your executives' needs are in the business, how they like to show up, right? You learn where you need to flex, right? You learn that, okay, in certain instances, so you can almost predict, right, once you have that knowledge, what your executives' responses are going to be to these various things. So, my exec and I have always had a very honest and open and transparent relationship. So feedback for us is more data versus an attack against the person or something that the other person did wrong. And I think if you approach the feedback and the honesty with your exec, right, making sure that you're keeping your own emotional center in place, you can be a lot more effective. I think you also have to decide and be very conscious of when you give the feedback, when you're honest. Know when your executive is open to receiving it and when they're not, right? So in the middle of travel, when they have a million things going on, their schedule is stacked, is not the time to ping them with a piece of feedback, right? So when you give them the feedback and how you tell that story is hugely important.
I'll just add on to something that I really admire about my executive, which is when he delivers feedback to me, it's always about the outcome and not about the person. So if he doesn't like something, it's not, he doesn't like the way I did it. It's like he doesn't like the thing. And another thing that he says, and this I think is to Andrew's point about timing your feedback, he says very often, next time, can you ... And so it makes me think, okay, this wasn't exactly what he wanted, but he was okay with it. And so when we deliver that feedback to our executives, can we say, next time, can you loop me in sooner? I think I could do a much more effective job that way. Next time, can you send me an email instead of texting me because I lost track of it? And I know it's a lot to ask, but next time, can you try? And everybody, I think, wants to be helpful in a partnership like this. And so they'll take it to heart.
It's such a good point. I think going back to that observation piece, if you're able to observe how your executive gives feedback, then quite often that's probably how they like to receive feedback. So you can mirror it, but it's being observant of how they do that. Which, hopefully then they take it in the way that it's meant.
Absolutely.
But it's scary. I think you can agree with it. For a lot of assistants, particularly at new assistants, it's a scary prospect giving feedback, or even if it's data driven, to somebody who's owner of a business or the CEO, or you know, it comes with time and confidence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is very scary. It is extremely scary. I mean, I remember times, you know, in other roles where giving that feedback, it's really terrifying, you know. And I think, which is why I mentioned really managing your own feelings around it, because, you know, the ultimate purpose is for you to make your executive more successful, make them a more efficient manager, and things of that nature. So the advice that you're giving them, the feedback, is not destructive. You know, it is constructive, you know, but you really do have to be careful how you tell the story, when you tell the story, and under what circumstances, you know.
Right. And then what's your end game? What is it that you
exactly
want?
What is your end game? Yeah. What do you want? Yep.
Yeah, that's
and
very
realize
true.
you're not going to get all of what you want.
Right,
like,
right.
You get 50% of it. You know?
So always ask for more. Always ask for more.
Oh yeah.
Always ask for more. Then you can roll it back.
Right, exactly.
It's true. Another aspect of managing up that I want to talk to you about is the art of managing sideways and down as well, because that's something, again, that assistants, you know, work across all aspects of the business. It's something that they need to be proficient at. So I just wondered how you've kind of how that manifests in the role and careers that you've both had.
I think it really does show up in different ways. I feel like, you know, depending upon who you're supporting and what type of industry and office that you work in. For me at Reddit specifically, there has been, I think, there's been really great advantages to making connections with the people that my exec has directly under them, who their direct reports are, building those relationships. And also looking at the skip level relationships, those with, you know, the directors, VPs, you know, whatever that skip level management cadre looks like, and really kind of reaching out to them as well to make those connections. I think, you know, managing in a way also to understand what they have on their plate, what things they're dealing with. And the reason I say that is because whenever you know, as EAs, we get bombarded with requests for our person's time. And I think, you know, in some instances, there is kind of this triggered humanistic reaction to just kind of resist doing it, you know, because it's like, you know, everyone wants their time, you know, they only have a certain number of hours in the day. What are they going to eat? You know, that kind of thing. But if you take the time to understand what that person's function is, how it ladders up to the larger strategic objectives, and also what they have going on just in their own kind of silo, right? Because that's kind of the world we live in with COVID and the remote work. So, you know, understanding that and really kind of, I think to Pam's earlier point, saying, okay, not quite now, but next time, right? And really keeping that top of mind. There have been instances where I've had multiple calls with skip level individuals, managers in the organization, not for any, you know, tactical reason, but just to understand what their workflow is, what are the headwinds that they're currently dealing with, what help do they need from management, you know, things of that nature, to really be that, you know, go-between between the individual and my exec. So that's really what your role kind of entails, even though it's not really explicitly stated in most senses, but really understanding what those relationships are, how they ladder up into the larger strategic position of the organization, and making sure those people are getting the time. It may not be in the way that they want. So for example, they may get a half hour versus 60 minutes. It may have to be async in certain instances versus a call. But you maintain those relationships, you build on them, and you make your executive aware of any blind spots that are happening. One more quick point. So there have been instances where I've had to gauge the urgency of the ask, right? So if this person wants time with my executive, is it truly urgent? You know, and there may be times where a call with me to provide context, to give them, you know, to answer questions will be a good, you know, you know, kind of segue into Jen, right? So it's not like, you know, so she doesn't have to meet with them, but that person's still getting their needs met and their questions answered.
Yeah, I mean, and that comes with a lot of time and practice and building your business acumen and your understanding of what's going on in the organization. Because again, it's that, as eloquently as you put it, Pam, it's yes, but with extras. And in that sense, it's it's me. First of all. and then you might get time with the executive. Pam, is for you, what has it been like in your career to have that kind of sideways management up and down and having that overall picture of the business?
So I think for me, I've had several roles where I've been a people manager as well, in addition to my EA responsibilities. And I'm in one of those dynamics now. And I think the number one thing for me is to operate in as much transparency as I can. And one of the things that's, I know this audience, but I absolutely 100% mean this. The way that you understand things and get things done in any business is by having a network of admins. Like, who your folks are, who you can contact. And when you're operating in as much transparency as you can, from a place of good judgment and responsibility and that sort of thing, then you have all these resources where you can help to manage through a project, manage through an issue. And, it occurs to me that it's like sending a bat signal sometimes. It's, I need this. I have no authority here, to Andrew's earlier point about influencing without authority. But I need somebody who's going to either give me this piece of information or help me negotiate this particular contract or something like that. That's a big part of it for me. And I think the other part is, when you are in a dynamic where you are a people manager as well, really keeping in mind where that work product goes and how to manage through that. So for instance, I am the manager of another administrative assistant, but the administrative assistant doesn't support me. She supports our exec as well. And so in that dynamic, her work product goes through him. So I need to make sure that as I manage down technically from an org chart perspective, I understand that I'm actually managing horizontally and vertically, because what she does impacts him every single day. And so I just make a point not to be an obstacle or a blocker. And then it helps me to really see very clearly, oh, okay, my actual literal management responsibilities here are career development and, opportunity creation. And with respect to workflow and work allocation, that comes naturally through conversations that she has explicitly with our exec, and I don't even have to be involved. So it's a way to manage, to just keeping in mind that we can trust each other. And that's why, once we know we can trust each other, I should say, then you can be transparent and you don't have to worry about motives or anything like that.
It's such a good point, though, because I think you can kind of put that level of understanding almost across not necessarily the entire business, but those that you interact with on a really regular basis. Is where do I fit into their relationship with the executive, and how can I help that relationship be the best that can be? It's just giving it that thought beyond, okay, how am I partnering with my executive, but actually then starting to have a bigger understanding of the organization and where your role fits in other parts of it. So I think that's a really good point. It isn't necessarily a piece of advice that assistants who solely have another management level to it, but how they interact with other parts of the organization and other colleagues. I think that's really helpful. So my last question, and I don't know if you've got any kind of stories or anything like that around this one, but I wonder if you've given some thought to the pitfalls that come with managing up. If there are any, if there's some things that potentially new assistants should kind of be aware of before they go away from the summit today and go off and manage up. If there's anything you think that they should just think about before they dip their toe in the water. Pam.
The number one thing that comes to mind for me is we always have to stay in our lane. We are hired in these roles because we are experts in the administrative field. Our execs are not necessarily. So when we want to try to take an opportunity to manage up, so to speak, that space is the perfect place to do it. maybe a not so perfect place to do it is, here's what I think you should do at the next board meeting. I think, and maybe that is appropriate. I didn't mean that actually to be facetious, but it's possible that in order for your manager to understand this is how they are managing me, is to really dig in where your subject matter expertise is and then expand from there.
Yeah, exactly. I completely understand what you mean. You don't necessarily want to be, writing the budget. I get what you mean. And Andrew.
Pitfalls. That's a great question. The main pitfall that comes to mind for me to watch out for is make sure in your managing up that you are responding, not reacting. I think sometimes you really have to step back and really make sure that what you are trying to manage up about, that it's worth it, number one, because every instance either adds to the trust bucket or takes away from it, right? So, there's that part of it. So, is this a battle you should be fighting is the first thing you need to ask yourself. And then step back and really kind of understand what your emotions are around it, because there is that piece. And make sure that when you do attempt to manage up with your exec in whatever facet and context that shows up, to always be able to back it up. I'll give you kind of some color around the example I provided earlier when, we had this offsite this week I was telling Pam about earlier, and Jen, being the person she is, wants to have all these one-on-ones. And then that question being, does this send the right message, right? In the context of the event, there's more networking, there's ad hoc collision factor stuff happening. And she said to me, say more, like what's the context here? So as I explained it to her, long story short, she acquiesced, not because she wouldn't have originally, but because the context made sense, right? The reason why I was giving this feedback makes sense. So make sure you have that clear first and foremost. I think second pitfall that I would say watch out for is be careful when you use the manage up, right? There are certain things that your boss is just not going to budge on, right? So you put that into the bucket of, okay, these things aren't things that I can manage up. It is what it is. This is how they are. I have to live with it. Once you recognize what those things are, managing up becomes less a purposeful action you take and more a product of how you support your executive, right? So there's not these instances where you're saying, okay, this is a great opportunity for me to manage up. Let me do that. You're building it into your support model, right? And you're doing it in a way where it doesn't feel like you're managing up, but that's what you're doing, right? So, you really are part psychologist, part, part therapist, part travel coordinator, and part mentor in a lot of areas. And I think that's where this managing up piece really comes in. So I'll say this, a lot of the headwinds are very specific to your exec. They're very nuanced, right? But just making sure that you are approaching it the right way as an assistant is super critical and super key. And keep those emotions in check.
Yeah, I love what you've said there. It's about being thoughtful, isn't it? It's about, it's about that. It's giving yourself the time and space, which I know is hard when you're running 100 miles an hour, but, giving yourself that time and space to really think through what you can do to help your executive be successful. It's to the point you just made, Nikki, I think, we as EAs, as you said, run 1,000 miles a minute, right? There's things that are, eating up our attention, our cognitive load. But I think taking the time to step back and pause and really give this some intentional thought is key, even if it happens in the middle of your workday. 15, 20 minutes to really kind of sit back before you respond. The world's not going to explode. You'll be fine. I was just trying to work out how many miles that was in kilometers for our other assistants around the world. Right, but then you took it to 1,000 miles a second. And I thought, I think they'll get, it's a lot. You're going at a pace.